This is Lisa Miller and Associates, Florida Insurance Roundup, your podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. Now, here's Lisa Miller.
Welcome, friends. Sometimes the problems of the present can be solved through looking at the problems of the past. And so it is today with Florida's property insurance market. There are some who say that the market is still broken, that reforms instituted by the Florida legislature in 2022 and 2023 have not worked, have not led to lower homeowners rates, and that a lack of claims fairness and dysfunctional regulation are to blame. Sometimes the solutions to present-day problems are right in front of us. There is a multi-bill effort in the Florida legislature right now to roll back the property insurance reforms of 2022 and 2023, and I am witnessing it every day. The effort, the arguments for doing so, and the people behind it sound very familiar to our guest today on the Florida Insurance Roundup and his experience 20 years ago. Yes, 20 years ago, in arguably the most successful insurance reform effort in our state's history. I wanted to bring this special guest to our podcast today because it's so helpful to me and will be very beneficial to you. Joining us today is Jon Shebel, the former longtime president and CEO of Associated Industries of Florida, often called AIF. At the time, it was the largest business association in Florida, and Jon, with his great team, led one of the most significant overhauls of Florida's workers' compensation system, reversing sky-high insurance rates and reshaping the business landscape. I was a deputy commissioner at the time in the early 2000s and worked with Jon and the team to tackle the highest workers' comp rates in Florida. We were at the top of the spear. Jon, I'm so very appreciative that you're joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lisa. It's nice being with the voice of insurance in Florida.
Thank you for that, Jon. And I'll tell you, it's just strange for me to reflect on how history repeats itself in so many different ways in the Florida public policy arena and, of course, in politics. But not any industry, but especially in the insurance industry. So I'm going to set the stage for our listeners. Back in the early 2000s, as I said, Florida had the highest workers' compensation rates in the country, particularly roofing companies and high-risk workers' comp companies were threatening or were going out of business. Jon, what was driving this crisis? Can you tell us what was going on at that point in time?
As you know, Lisa, the biggest issue was litigation. Plaintiff attorneys had free rein to convince injured workers to sue their employers, often leading to drawn-out cases that weren't necessarily, and most often were not, in the workers' best interests. The more these lawsuits piled up, the higher the workers' comp costs soared, making it increasingly expensive for businesses to provide coverage for their injured workers.
And do you remember either a particular case or trends that illustrated just how out of control the lawyer fees and litigation system had become?
Yeah, the typical cases were the legal fees ended up costing more than the actual medical treatment and dollar benefits for the injured worker. For example, there were cases where the attorneys were awarded tens of thousands of dollars in fees for a minor claim that should have been resolved quickly. It was clear the system had become more about legal battles than about the workers' benefits.
And I know AIF, one of the leading business lobby advocacy organizations in the state, they were the loudest in the reform efforts at that time. What was your strategy to try to get a handle on what was crippling our economy back during these times?
Well, after years of research, we determined the plaintiff involvement was the problem. So we knew that if we could limit how lawyers got paid in workers' compensation, we could curb the incentives that drove excessive litigation and increase workers' benefits at the same time. AIF worked with the lawmakers to pass reforms that put strict limits on attorneys' fees and ensured that the system would work for the truly injured workers rather than turning into a legal battleground that only benefited the plaintiff lawyers.
I know those of you listening are thinking, my goodness, this sounds so familiar. So I'll throw you another one, John. In the reforms of 2003 to 2005, what were some of the main provisions and changes that you were championing to make sure that we could get a handle on this?
Well, the main provision included capping attorneys' fees, streamlining the claims process, and implementing stricter guidelines to prevent unnecessary lawsuits. This not only reduced legal costs, but also ensured injured workers got the benefits they needed faster without the delays that litigation often caused.
And of course, I was with you working at the time in the regulatory arena, and I heard the critics argue that limiting attorneys' fees would hurt workers and limit access to justice. How did you respond to those accusations?
Well, that's a comment that you hear every year in every issue relating to insurance where the lawyers come in. But the reality was then and is now otherwise. Our goal was never to take away employee workers' rights, but to ensure the system wasn't being abused. In fact, one of the advocates who stood alongside us was the president of the Florida AFL-CIO representing injured workers. By cutting unnecessary litigation, we made sure more money went towards medical care for the injured worker and dollar benefits that went in the worker's pocket, rather than to spend all the money on legal fees, which the system was doing at the time. Over time, this led to a more stable and affordable workers' comp system. And I might add that the workers' comp rates in Florida have gone down every year since that reform passed.
Congratulations for that great accomplishment, John. And the impact, I remember it wasn't overnight, but it took some time. I know it was a tremendous impact when you and your team were able to push these reforms through the legislature. Describe what that was like.
Well, the impact was massive. The first signal that we got that things were working is workers' comp law firms started going out of business. For example, we had a law firm in Lakeland that was one of the biggest abusers of 15 lawyers. And within the first year, the whole firm went out of business. Almost immediately after the reforms, workers' compensation rates started to decline. Over the years, Florida went from having the highest rates in the country to some of the lowest. This made it easier for businesses to operate, created jobs, and ensured workers received treatment more quickly and more dollars in their pockets.
That's awesome, John. I'm astonished as you lay this out here, and frankly had forgotten some of the hard work that you and your team had done. And I'm glad we're having this conversation 20 years later, at how the history of workers' comp reforms mirrors what Florida just went through with our property insurance, consumer, and litigation reforms, and the challenges being faced right now in the 2025 legislature to undo those reforms, which I want to ask you about in a moment. But, you know, as it is with workers' comp, as I remember, it has been with property insurance, and that as soon as regulators and lawmakers close one loophole that's being exploited, the bad actors are trying to exploit another. You know, I listened to former Florida Insurance Commissioner David Altmaier famously liken it to a game of whack-a-mole from a March 22 news conference where he talked about what the initial reforms were before the Florida legislature. I want you to take a listen to what Commissioner Altmaier said at the time.
So you have a roof issue, right? So roof claims are what's driving costs, right? So the question is, well, how come it's roof claims? What is it about roofs that caused them to be? So we didn't have roof claims 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, you had roof claims, but not to the extent that we're seeing now. So when you start to peel back the onion about how did we get this influx of roof claims, well, it coincides with legislation that was effective in closing our assignment of benefits loopholes, right? And so you can go all the way back to mold claims Once you put a $10,000 cap on mold claims, suddenly nobody had a mold claim anymore. Now they had sinkhole claims. And once you put a definition of catastrophic ground cover collapse in, now nobody had those kinds of claims anymore. Now they've got water claims. And so we moved from issue to issue, and the one consistent theme in all of those issues is an excessive amount of litigation in our state. The governor just mentioned a statistic that we put out: 76% of all of the country's litigation in the homeowners insurance space happens in Florida.
Jon, is what former Commissioner Altmaier talking about, does that sound familiar?
Well, it almost makes me want to laugh, but it's such a serious matter. I certainly don't want to laugh about it. But it mimics what every commissioner has ever said, what you said as deputy commissioner, and what everybody in the regulatory environment in Florida has said. And it's true. What happens is every legislative session, the trial lawyers come in every line of insurance with bills not to represent the injured party, but to represent their pocketbooks. And they try to amend every insurance law that they can to increase their opportunity to have an unfair advantage to sue the insurance carriers. That happens every session. You have the bills that you've alluded to and others in there today to do that throughout all the insurance chapters. And then, as you know, Lisa, in the final 2 or 3 days of the legislature, there'll be amendment after amendment that they try to sneak on various bills to do the same thing. So it's what the trial lawyers do every session. It never stops. It never ends.
You know, Jon, you just speak a parable, as a friend of mine used to say when somebody was speaking truth to power. I've often asked third parties, public adjusters, lawyers that insert themselves, why they don't tell a claimant, a policyholder that's upset with their insurance company, try the free services of the Department of Financial Services. Mediation is free. Having a consumer services specialist intervene in the disagreement between the company and the policyholder. And ironically, I can never get a trial lawyer or a public adjuster or others that insert themselves to say, that's a great idea. I'll let the policyholder try the free services first. Of course, the policyholder can always hire a lawyer or a third party. So I will keep singing that message. And a lot of the reforms that you've talked about for the sake of trying to reduce these, what the governor calls billboard lawyers, he calls it a cottage industry. We're seeing that industry bubble up, particularly in the House of Representatives, with several bills that many of you that follow our newsletter, House Bill 1551, House Bill 1047. I can give you all the numbers. They're all in our newsletter. But in every instance, and there's over a half a dozen bills that are designed to reinstate, make it easier for lawsuits to go forward, ensure that attorneys' fees are at the top of the spear versus the interest of consumers. And, I had one colleague call it, this session being the Trial Lawyers Full Employment Act of 2025, and it seems to be more honest to call that. And make no mistake, I have great colleagues and friends in the plaintiff lawyer industry who truly do represent consumers that just can't get to yes with their insurance companies. And not every insurance company is perfect, and they'll admit that themselves, Jon. But your leadership 20 years ago, I will be referring to that as we move through this session, and I want to applaud you for what you did. And as you read my newsletter and you watch what's going on this session, what advice would you give the legislators who are trying to either reinstate, the ability for attorney fees to be more prevalent or reverse some of the governor's reforms? What advice would you give them, Jon?
Well, I think they ought to look at the reality and look at the data that relates to all this litigation. And not just react to the trial lawyers' pitches, because basically the trial lawyers, and I don't blame them, they're looking out for their pocketbook. They want to make a profit like everybody in the system. But one of the things that I think is important for the carriers is that they have a true system within their own companies. When people do call, as you're saying, and people should call their insurance company first when they have a problem, that they have a true system within their own company to listen to people. Because, as you know, Lisa, things got so bad, all the workers' comp companies pulled out of Florida, and we as an employer association started our own company, which today the successor company that bought us is the largest writer of workers' comp in Florida. We immediately installed a section within the company that when people called, they listened. And we resolved a lot of injured workers' problems when they call. We said, whoops, yeah, we didn't do this right, or we made a mistake, or we didn't know that. And we resolved the issue right there. Of course, that didn't stop the litigation. They sued on everything that was, so it keeps going. But it's better if the companies do that. And basically, the legislators just need to look at data. The data tells the story. I think the key to us succeeding back in the day when we reformed that law was Marianne Stiles, who, as you know, who was our general counsel and the key person in this reform. She did 3 years worth of study, night and day, pulling data from files. So they ought to ask people, show me your data. I want to see the data on this. And if you look at the data, it tells the story, as you well know, as one of the former key regulators.
We are trying. There actually was a data call instituted by the legislature back in Senate Bill 7602 3 years ago. And one of the components of that data call was to require insurance companies to provide the fees that they were paying to plaintiff lawyers. Well, of course, the plaintiff lawyers will not report that data to the insurance companies. I have been in a spirited conversation with a leading trial lawyer in the state, citing that a Florida bar rule requires plaintiff lawyers to provide what's called a closing statement or a settlement statement to their clients at the conclusion of a case, which would outline their fees. And all the plaintiff lawyers would have to do would be to provide those closing statements, settlement statements to the regulator so he can look at the fee situation on an annual basis. To this date, none of the plaintiff lawyers have provided that information to the regulator or to the insurance companies so they can comply with that provision of the law. And I think the regulator is very well aware of that, and we know why they're not providing it. But look no further, and I have to remind the audience, the poster child of Scott Strems, of the former Strems law firm of Coral Gables, who was, disbarred by the Florida Supreme Court, and later even settled a RICO lawsuit with Citizens Property Insurance when Citizens was, showing unequivocally what he was doing in terms of being a cottage industry in and of itself and just throwing thousands of lawsuits at the wall, hoping that they would stick. It just seems to be that history is repeating itself. And even with, we have a trial lawyer, a plaintiff lawyer in the House of Representatives, Representative Hillary Cassell, who I respect tremendously, but I disagree with her with House Bill 1551 and the attempt to undo the governor's push for these reforms.
One of the things, Lisa, one of the things you just mentioned it is, unethical for legislators to vote on issues that directly affect them financially. Mm-hmm. But they do it time after time, and they ought to really enforce that rule.
Speaking of enforcing the rule, did you see the Florida Supreme Court or others that oversee lawyer activity get involved with some of the lawyers that were driving the cottage industry and work comp 20 years ago? Have you ever seen a lawyer besides Scott Strems being sanctioned for that kind of activity?
No. Yeah. And as you know, 50 years ago, the Supreme Court handed over regulation, the daily regulation of lawyer activity, to the Florida bar. Now that's that was probably not the right thing to do, but the Florida bar now is the one who does all the investigations and so forth. Then they take it to the Supreme Court, who takes the final action. But the Supreme Court ought to take issue with all this, and they should now look at the practice of law in Florida, and they should issue some more stringent regulations to stop all this stuff. They haven't done that in the last 50 years. they've kind of left it to the bar to overview it. I think it's okay for the bar to do the administrative action for the court, but the court today needs to come out, hold hearings, look at all this, and then issue rules on the practice of law, because those rules are lacking, and it needs to be tightened up.
Thank you for that, John. And just to close the circle, I would just say that your leadership at AIF played a pivotal role and gave us a great foundation, for the changes in workers' comp. And we are just so hopeful that we can continue your legacy of making sure that the consumer, the injured worker, the policyholders at the top of the spear. Any final thoughts for us, John?
Well, I do have one final thought with regard to everything that the business community and the injured workers and the people that file insurance claims and so forth are facing every year. I think that it probably ought to put all the fees for lawyers and things in one chapter. Take it out of all the various insurance sections of the law, which are spread all over the place, and put all the fees in one chapter so it can be looked at in one place relating to all the areas of the insurance code, because you can't keep up with all these bills and amendments that come flying out of nowhere. As you remember, Lisa, years ago, in the final days of the legislative session, the trial lawyers filed an amendment to a Medicaid law. It ended up being the biggest lawsuit in the history of the state of Florida. 12 law firms filed a lawsuit under that amendment. They came out of nowhere, and they filed it against the tobacco companies. The result was the lawsuit was settled because the attorney's fees that the tobacco companies were paying would far exceed what they would have to pay in the end. So these 12 law firms, for the rest of their lives and their successors' lives, will collect virtually hundreds of millions of dollars in fees. And the benefit of the lawsuit did not go to one person. Wow. Not one smoker, not one person who got cancer from smoking, not anybody got a nickel. Only the law firms won. And that was an amendment out of nowhere. So I would suggest that you advocate that all the fees relating to the insurance code go in one chapter, and then everybody can look at that. You know what it is. You know where it is. It's not spread throughout all these sections, because you know how big the code is and how confusing it can become, even to a former deputy insurance commissioner. Mm-hmm. It can be confusing, So I would just suggest that one thing might help everybody.
That is great, sage advice, and we know that good policy just doesn't happen by accident. It takes a lot of hard work, good data, right, willingness to challenge the status quo. Thank you so much, John, for joining us today. I know you are watching intently and you care deeply about this state and the success of our economy. And we are supporting, the governor's vision about keeping the cottage industry and the billboard lawyers back where they belong. Yeah.
This governor has been a great governor for all this. He's really looked out for fairness in all this. And he's a lawyer. He knows what's going on. He spots all this, and he's been a great governor for trying to keep fairness in the insurance code.
Thank you for that, John. And I started this podcast by noting that there were some who say the market isn't working, the reforms went too far, they haven't led to lower rates, lack of access to justice. But I'm here to say unequivocally, the inconvenient truth is that these reforms are working in bringing down homeowners and automobile insurance rates. And you can look no further than Florida Insurance Commissioner Michael Jaworski's new report called titled Florida's Tort Reform, and look at all the great data that's in that. We'll put that in our show notes. But it basically shows that all indicators are heading in the right direction as new rates make their way into policies. Where 2 years ago we saw double-digit increases, we're not seeing that anymore. Very, very encouraging. So tell me from our audience, let us hear from you. What's your experience been? Many agents communicate with me after we release these podcasts, and they're on the front lines every day. We salute our insurance agents who are saying we are seeing rates flat or down. If I hear that another time, I'm just going to keep smiling to hear that, and things are going and heading in the right direction. You can call us and leave us a message at 850-388-8002. That's 850-388-8002. Of course, send me an email at Lisa Miller at lisamillerassociates.com. That's Lisa Miller, all one word, at lisamillerassociates.com. And I hope that you'll follow us on all of our social media accounts, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, and like and follow all of us on your favorite podcast platform. So if you want to stay in the know, go to our website, www.lisamillerassociates.com, and you can sign up for free for our newsletter, our podcast, and certainly email me with your questions. So that's a wrap for today's session. Jon Shebel, who has been incredible leader, still is in our state over 20 years ago, sharing his experience about what it was to bring workers' comp rates down from the highest to probably the bottom 5 lowest in our country, all because we were able to extract the attorney fee insanity out of that line of business. Thank you for being a part of this. And remember, we have a passion at our firm for great public policy and client success. I'm Lisa Miller, and until next time, stay safe, Florida.
This has been Lisa Miller and Associates Florida Insurance Roundup, your podcast on the people, issues, and regulations shaping Florida's insurance market. For more information on today's program, please visit us on the web at www.lisamillerassociates.com.